Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar on a systemic approach to coaching. I am Fatima Hussain, psychologist and senior research analyst at uExcelerate, and I will be moderating today's session. But before we get started with the session, I'd love to quickly tell you a little bit about uExcelerate, who we are, and our offerings. We are a SaaS platform enabling organizations to scale and build a sustainable coaching culture, fostering personalized leadership development for the whole self and the whole system. And we have 4 unique product offerings that can help you in this. First is Appraise. Appraise is our offering that helps organizations discover their stage of coaching culture maturity based on our 7C framework. And the model provides action items that can help organizations mature to higher levels of coaching culture. Second is Discover, our curated coach marketplace that connects employees to a pool of diversified, experienced, and certified coaches for specific requirements in their organizations. Third is Symphony, our coaching platform that helps you launch on-demand, one-on-one, and group coaching engagement programs by onboarding your leaders as internal coaches and employees as agents. And finally, PACE, our tailored coaching programs that are backed by research, some of which include leadership development, D&I, mental well-being, high-performance acceleration, leader as a coach, and much more. And with these offerings, we make a tangible difference to our clients' business solutions. A little bit of housekeeping for the webinar. Today's session will last 60 minutes. The final 15 minutes is going to be a Q&A session with our audience. So if you have any questions for our speaker during the session, then please leave them in the Q&A box and we'll put them to him in the last 15 minutes. You can also share your thoughts in the comments. We love having an interactive session, so please keep sharing your thoughts and comments. You will also be sent a recording of this session once the webinar is over. I'll give you this. And yeah, that's the house. So let's get started with the session. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. A well-known thought leader in the coaching industry, Dr. Paul Lawrence. Dr. Paul Lawrence is the founder and MD of Leading Systemically. He has worked as a coach and consultant in the field of leadership, coaching, and change for more than 20 years across all industries, governments, and nonprofits. With over 4,500 hours of coaching experience, he is also an honorary researcher at Oxford Books University. He has authored more than a dozen academic articles and book chapters and 4 books. His 5th book, written in partnership with Dr. Susie Skinner, The Wise Leader, is due for publication early in 2022, among other works. And with that, I'm very happy to invite Dr. Paul Lawrence to take the stage. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Okay. There we go. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
It's cool. So thank you very much for coming. So today I'm going to talk about different approaches of thinking about systems and how they show up in the way that we might coach. We face a lot of big issues in the world today, issues that we're perhaps not doing a brilliant job in addressing, issues like climate change, COVID. These are big scale issues, but our leaders are facing other issues too, like the impact of technology and how to use technology. How do we service the need of multiple stakeholders? And lots of other issues too. A pressing one at the moment is the desire of people to work from home. All of this is really complex. And so it requires of us, perhaps, that we think differently. This is a quote from Hofkirchner and Rousseau. The crises, or just the issues we face today, are systemic in nature. To overcome those crises, we need to understand how systems work. To arrive at such an understanding, we need to think systemically. So we'll ask you a poll, and we're going to ask you another poll at the end. But this poll, the question is, as a coach, do you consider yourself a systemic coach? Do you coach systemically? Yes, no, or not sure? How are we going with the poll?
I think everyone's answered.
Cool. Do we have the results? Lovely. Yeah, lovely. So about a third of people, just over a third of people have said, yes, I coach systemically. That's not an uncommon answer. So I started doing this work on systems a couple of years ago because this phrase systemically was getting used a lot. And so I'd ask people, I'd ask coaches, so do you coach systemically? Do you think systemically? And people said, yes, I think systemically and I coach systemically. But when I asked people, well, what does that actually mean? The most common answer was, well, I step back and I take a holistic view of what's going on here. And I thought, I think there's more to it than that. The systems theory literature talks about systemic thinking in all sorts of different ways. So maybe we're missing something. What doesn't help is the kind of commercial world. This is a quote from quite a long time ago about systems thinking, what wasn't in the coaching community, but this is Lane and Jackson saying this term systems thinking seems to be being used in a way which isn't terribly precise, and it's being used by people who don't necessarily or haven't necessarily made the time to really explore what that term means and the different ways of thinking about that term. And they said, well, look, this term systems thinking, lots of enthusiasm, but its use seems to be somewhat dictatorial. And people, this isn't even in the coaching space, people using that phrase to describe their own single methodology, almost trying to ring fence the use of this phrase systems coaching or systemic. And we see that in the coaching space now, people trademarking phrases like systems coaching. Without necessarily describing exactly what it means or comparing it to other different ways of thinking about systems. So the question for you is, well, in what way do you think systemically? If you said yes, what do you mean by that? In what way do you think systemically? And it's an important question, because if we do need to think differently in facing complexity, and our leaders, the people that we coach, need to think differently, the way that we think, and this is a sobering thought, the way that we think is very much influenced by others. And so you have a role to play, because the way that your coachees experience you shows up. It has an influence in the way that they think. So from that perspective, we all have I would say almost a responsibility to think about the way we think. So there's this need to think differently, which applies just as much to us as the leaders who are out there tackling complexity. There is a lovely framework that we can talk about when we're talking about different ways of thinking called the 3 Ps. I don't have time to talk about that today, but if you come to our longer webinar in February, where we've got 3 hours to talk about this, I'll be talking about the 3 Ps and how to really challenge yourself in the way that you think and how that shows up in the way that you behave. What I'm going to do today is give you an overview of these 5 different ways of thinking about systems. 5 different ways of thinking systemically. And as I do so, I'm going to go through each of these 5, have a bit of a think about, if you had a pile of 100 counters in front of you, how many counters would you allocate to each way of thinking? Which way of thinking perhaps is the way that is most typical of how you show up in the coaching space? So that's your task. My task obviously is to try and explain these 5 ways of thinking systemically, nice and succinctly in the time that we have today. First of all, linear systemically. The idea here is that I can control change. The leader can control change. The leader can step out of a system, step out of the organization, and view it as a neutral observer, see what's going on inside his or her organization, decide which levers to pull such that they change what's happening inside the organization. If that's my philosophy as a leader, then I very much believe in control. I do my job by pulling these levers. My positional authority is my primary source of power. And of course, because I believe in control, people will do as they ask, so long as I've explained myself clearly, unless they're somehow resistant to change. This is the notion that A plus B equals C. If in my organization we have low engagement rates, then all I need to do is identify which levers to pull, maybe raise salaries, give people more flexibility around work location, and that will give me a lovely engaged organization. This way of thinking, really common, and we see it all the time. COVID, for example, this is one leader talking about COVID early on in the pandemic. We've got it totally under control. Notice this emphasis on control. It's just one person coming in from China. We've got it under control. It's going to be fine. We're using the full power of federal government to defeat the virus. That's what we've been doing. It's very contagious. It's incredible, but we've got control over it. Another leader, again, this emphasis on control. We're seeing a bit of a warning light on the dashboard. Numbers are going up, but we just need to squeeze the brake pedal or pull the lever in order to keep the virus under control. So thinking about COVID as an example, if I'm thinking through that linear systemic lens, and we've got 10 cases, it's early doors, early on in the pandemic, we've got 10, so we better watch out, because if we've got 10 now, we might have 100 cases in 10 days' time. So we need to pull some levers here. We need to wear masks. We need to do social distancing. And if we do that, we can control the further progression of the pandemic. So I use the pandemic as an example to illustrate this way of thinking. What about as a coach, though? If I'm coaching through this lens, if I find myself coaching through this lens, then I myself regard myself as a neutral observer. The organization is a system. It's a simple system, like a hot water system. I'm a neutral observer. I'm external to that organization. Coaching is about competencies. You'll hear me very much talk about my competencies, and I can become a great coach by learning the competencies that I'm supposed to use, understand when I'm supposed to apply each competency, and I will be a brilliant coach. Again, maybe an indication of thinking through this linear systemic lens. I'm likely to think, if I just need to focus on the individual, if this individual comes up with some great actions, and so does this one, and so does this one, and so does this one, it will lead to the desired outcome. The world is really quite logical and straightforward. Coachees, if they come up with actions, they will of course follow up on those actions, unless they didn't really mean to do them in the first place. And I'm going to have a conversation about their motivation. So those are some of the things that I may believe in if and when I'm thinking through that linear systemic lens. And we're not, so have a think here about, again, the counters. How many of your counters are you going to allocate to this way of thinking as your way of thinking systemically? By the way, we're not trashing it. This way of thinking sometimes works. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. There are times when, if we encourage our coachee, for example, to spend more time listening to their colleague, then the relationship with that colleague may improve overnight. This way of thinking is sometimes useful. Sometimes it's not enough. Notice here, we're not trashing linear systemic. I'm not going to trash any of these ways of thinking. The paradigm here is, how many of these ways of thinking do I have access to? The second way of thinking systemically is nonlinear systemic. Now in this, if I'm thinking through this lens, I still think I can control change as a leader. I can still step out the system and view it as a neutral observer, etc. But I'm almost expecting things to be a little bit more complicated than they might first appear. So I need to be smart. And we sense this in leaders who very much value their intelligence. Their intelligence may be thinking through a nonlinear systemic lens if they're privileging their intelligence over everything else. By the way, we talk about this idea of people tagging their own view of systems thinking and saying, this is systems thinking. I'm not saying that's what Peter Senge did in the 90s, but he had a particular way of looking at systems. It was described in the 5th Discipline Handbook, and for quite a long time, that was systems thinking. Remember always, there are various different ways of thinking about systems. So to describe this one, change is more complicated. Imagine a little factory. There's a little factory. Little things tend to go wrong on the factory floor, and there's an office. There's an office of about 10 people whose job it is to work out when these problems happen and fix them, to keep the whole production line going. And it works pretty well most of the time. However, what happened, we're here in team member 6, is one day a couple of team members fell sick. So now we've got 8 people doing 10 people's job. And what happened in the first couple of days is some of the issues that were raised in the factory didn't get addressed. And those unresolved issues led to further breakdowns. Now, unfortunately, at the end of day 1, 50 problems, 46 of them resolved, only 4 left unresolved. So the team thought, that's fine, we'll come back and fix those 4 issues tomorrow. We'll work a little harder. And if there's 50 issues again, we're really going to have to work hard and address those 54. When they came back the next day, there weren't 4 issues unresolved. All of a sudden, there were 24 issues resolved. And they thought, wow, what's going on here? And they worked extra hard to try and fix things. And by the end of day 3, they'd worked really hard, and they had now 10 issues unresolved. So they'd really cleared the backlog, and they came back next day thinking, we're going to fix those 10 issues. But those 10 issues then multiplied, and all of a sudden there's 120 issues. And of the 8, 3 people just had enough. They're just so tired and exhausted, they left. And then there's 5 people left, and there's 100 issues, and the whole system falls over. And the team sat down and said, what happened there? And of course, what happened there was the issues, the breakdowns. This was not a linear relationship. It wasn't a linear relationship. Those 4 issues that were unresolved triggered another 10 issues, and the or 20 issues, and the 10 issues that were unresolved at the end of day 3 resulted in 100 issues. Change is not always linear, and there is this kind of feedback loop between if something I do can result in then how I then behave. Change is more complicated than simply being able to pull levers. Let's look at COVID again. People kind of twigged onto this after we'd been in COVID a while. We've got 10 cases. Wow, we've got to watch out, because we might have 40,000 cases in 10 days' time, because each unresolved case can go and infect another 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And there's more than one version of COVID. Wow, there's lots going on here. So we need to be smart about this. We need to be clever about this if we are to control it. Notice the emphasis is still on control, but we're recognizing just how complicated the world is. Again, in the COVID space, this quote from Neil Abernethy, a professor in the States, kind of reflects this way of thinking that acknowledged how complicated COVID was. Wow, if we're going to control this, well, contact tracing isn't that straightforward. Staffing constraints, what happens when actually the people that we're relying upon to fix COVID get COVID themselves? We don't really understand enough about the infectiousness of the disease, how to control it, different variants and so on. So this was an acknowledgement of just how complicated COVID was. Now let's bring it back to coaching again. If this is how I think about coaching, I'm still a neutral observer. Coaching is still about competencies. Yes, I can become a great coach by learning what I'm supposed to do, but it's hard. It's not always easy to work out what I'm supposed to do and when. It's hard. It takes some practice here. Yeah, I need to focus on the individual, and though their actions should lead to the desired outcome, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's something more complicated going on. Coaches come up with actions and follow through on those actions unless they aren't motivated to do so. But it's not as simple as, you said you'd do it, why didn't you? Motivation can be more complicated than that. My style and how I'm likely to be perceived as a coach is quite intellectual. I'm a clever coach, and my approach is going to be quite intellectual. I'll probably value supervision, because supervision is useful, helping me think through some of these more complicated cases and leveraging the intelligence of some of the other my coach supervisor, or some of the other coaches in the room if I'm undertaking group supervision. So this is a different way of thinking about systems. The barrier to this way of thinking versus linear systemic is, again, think about your counters, that the barrier here is time. It may take me a bit more time to work out what's going on. And if I'm in a hurry as a leader, I may not make the time to stop and think through that non-linear systemic lens. If I'm a coach, maybe, I hear this sometimes in more inexperienced coaches, we've got 45 minutes and I need to make sure they get to an outcome in 45 minutes. That may have me thinking in that more linear systemic way versus the non-linear systemic way. I may not slow down and really think about what's going on here. And that's the second way of thinking about systems. And again, it may be enough, but there's 3 more ways of thinking about systems. Third way, collaborative systemic. Now, this is all about frogs. Okay, this is all about frogs. There was a Gregory Bateson was one of the people who originally started prodding us in this direction. And he got really excited when he read the study of somebody who'd done some research with frogs and found out that frogs can only see things that move. If they don't move, as far as the frog's concerned, they don't exist. And that was exciting for Bateson because he said, wow, ching, that's what we're like. We are actually quite subjective in what we choose to pay attention to. We're pretty subjective in how we choose to make sense of the world around us. We're very subjective, and we talk about ourselves sometimes and think about ourselves sometimes as if we're very objective, and we're not. So when we're facing a challenge or an issue that's really challenging and complicated, we need to recognize the limitations of our own perspective. Notice humility is starting to pop up, and we need to really get a few heads in the room, different subjective perspectives, and between us, we can come up with a kind of joint perspective on what's going on here. So we can control change. We, a group of us, can step out the system and view it as neutral observers. We need to be smart, and we need to collaborate. If a leader's thinking through this lens, this is a leader who is not doing lip service to collaboration. They have this genuine, you'll just hear them in the way that they talk, this need to access other people's perspectives. There'll be less emphasis on their own individual intelligence and a bit more emphasis on really needing to access other people's perspectives. It's a more, let's put it, inclusive way of leading. Yes. So I thought about this. My partner, or somebody who I knew, was very ill and was frustrated for quite a long time because different doctors were telling him different things about what might be going on for him. It wasn't until those doctors got together and had a conversation that they came up with a more aligned perspective of what was going on for him, because what was going on for him just wasn't obvious what was wrong. So we're all frogs. That's what this way of thinking is. One way of summing up this way of thinking. We're all frogs, and that thought that we're all frogs can evoke within us that humility and curiosity. I'm not sure how much we saw of that in COVID. This is Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales, who was absolutely locked in step with her medical advisors, her medical experts. She genuinely was interested in what they have to say and was accessing their perspectives. That wasn't true in all countries, but I'm not sure the politicians did a brilliant job in this space. So in Australia, for example, the different states of Australia spent as much time criticizing each other's responses as they did collaborating. So if you think about COVID, if I'm thinking about COVID through this lens and my leader, we've got 10 cases. It's not obvious what to do. I wonder what Singapore is doing, and South Korea and Canada, these countries that experienced SARS virus before we even had COVID. We can still control this, but we're going to need to do, learn, do. Again, I'm not sure that we saw a lot of that during COVID in that leadership. But we did see it elsewhere. I was doing a lot of work with a professional services firm at the time, and they came out quite early on to all the employees and said, we're not sure what's the best thing to do. We need to consult with each other and with others, and we need to do something, and then we need to do, learn, do from that. So some leaders were thinking through that space, through that lens. Now, if I'm coaching through this lens, I still think I'm a neutral observer. The system is the system. Coaching competencies are useful, but I'm recognizing the coaching competencies that each of the coaching associations have were basically a group of people coming together and comparing perspectives. So they're useful, they're valuable, but I'm going to take them with a little pinch of salt. Organizations are really complicated and there is no objective perspective. So I need to encourage my coachee to access multiple perspectives, to get out there and be curious about what other people are thinking about whatever's going on. And I want to access multiple perspectives too. So I'm going to be interested as the coach here I'm going to be very curious about what other people are thinking about my coachee's issue. I'm going to be interested in my coachee's mental model and the mental models of them with those people that they interact with. I'm going to see conflict through that lens of two different subjective perspectives coming together. Neither's necessarily right, neither's necessarily wrong. And if a coachee doesn't follow up on their actions, I'm going to be curious about what happened here. I'm not going to go straight to my own perspective as to what that means. Yes, so that's the third way of thinking systemically. How many counters would you like to give that one in terms of the extent to which you think that represents the way that you find yourself thinking and behaving in a coaching relationship? The barrier to this one is our belief in intelligence. And I haven't really got time to go through it today, but there's some lovely examples of organizations that absolutely fell over. And when you really poke and prod as to what went on, one of the things that seems to be going on is the leadership of that organization absolutely believed in their own intelligence, this preferencing of intelligence. The preferencing of intelligence can be a barrier to seeking other people's perspectives. Two more to go. Complex systemic. Now, this is really, really different. And I'm not going to go through a whole load of theory. I'm just going to tell a story. This happened just before COVID, and I was doing a coaching skills program, had 12 people in the classroom, and we stopped for morning tea. And at morning tea, everybody, except me, because I wasn't an employee, but everybody else was talking about this email they'd received that morning saying, hey, I know we promised you all a 10% bonus this year. And we said, no matter what, you'll get a 10% bonus, but market conditions haven't been good and we just haven't performed. So we're not going to be giving a 10% bonus this year. It's going to be 5%. Right. Now, I know people on that team, they'd really thought that through. They'd applied their intelligence. They'd thought it through. They'd reasoned it. And this email was a little bit longer than I've described. It had all the rationale, and they therefore expected people to go, yeah, I get it. I agree. But that's not what happened. One little group of people to my right, as I drank my tea and ate my biscuit, said, this is not acceptable. They said 10% no matter what. Once you've made that kind of promise, you have to stick by it. This is an integrity issue, and we're not happy. Over to my left, me being nosy, the group was saying, about time. People in this organization are not commercially savvy enough. Of course, you can't pay a 10% bonus if you come in as on the kind of results we've been delivering. Of course, you can't. Good on the executive. We've got to shift the mindset in this organization. Then I sort of walked around the bench, and a third group was saying, okay, I kind of get why we can't pay 10%, but our numbers this year are actually pretty much the same as last year's numbers. And last year we paid a 7.5% bonus. So why can't we pay 7.5%? So you had three different responses to this mandate from above. Different people engaging with each other, making sense of what they heard together. It's a social process. And the overall response of the organization would be an amalgam of all these different coalitions and ways of thinking, especially as people from those different coalitions, those different groups come together, and then they start comparing notes. So change is complex. As the executive team found out, you can't control change. You can't control what people think and do. You can't step out of the system, the organization, have a conversation as a neutral observer. That conversation you're having is part of the system. It's part of the system. It's part of what's going on. It's not a neutral conversation. Big, big thing for leaders to really consider here, because this says you cannot control change. And some leaders go, well, what's my job then? And the answer is, of course, you can influence change. And by the way, you do influence change. Everything you do as a leader influences change. It influences how people are thinking. And so through this lens, I'm thinking, yeah, as a leader, I need to engage with a broader network here. I can't control it. I can't rely on my positional authority and sending out emails and telling people what to do. I need to be out there in the organization, understanding the complexity of this organization. And that understanding will help me work out what to say to who in order to influence change. That's the complex systemic perspective based on theories of complex adaptive systems. And I've kind of described in simple terms how a complex adaptive system works. Now, again, didn't get too much of this in COVID. This was really interesting. I live in Sydney, Bondi Beach. Everyone's heard of Bondi Beach. One day in the middle of COVID, it was a beautiful day, and everyone went to Bondi Beach. They ignored the social distancing piece, not too many people wearing masks. And the local authorities were furious. And they said, this is unacceptable, it's irresponsible, we need to take measures. Now, what was interesting about that was the same phenomenon seemed to happen all over the world. It happened in the UK, in Bournemouth, happened in the US, in the Ozarks. I found all this out later, and somewhere else in the US. So there was a pattern emerging here. Now, if I'm thinking through this complex systemic lens, I'm not going to be saying, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. Notice the emphasis on control. I'm going to be going to the beach insofar as I can without my mask and social distancing. But I want to understand why those people are on the beach. I need to understand their perspective if I am to understand how the social system is working, this system that I'm seeking to influence. Again, didn't see too much of that myself in COVID, did see it in some other organizations. So I spoke to somebody who was on the board of a dance company in a city, and most of the students had moved to the city because it was a prestigious dance company, and they didn't know very many people, and they'd all been told self-isolate because we need to control COVID. Social distancing, really important, and if you do that, we can keep the school open. And then one day they all went to a party. It was somebody's birthday. Somebody had COVID spread. They had to shut the dance school. Now, some people on that board were cross, but other people were also curious. And they said, this is what I was told by somebody on the board. Yeah, this is the conversation we had. These are young people living alone without strong friendships in this community. They need social interaction. I can only imagine what it was feeling like for them, and how tempted they were at this prospect of spending some time with other people. So in COVID, if I was thinking through that lens, I'm thinking, we've got 10 cases. The system's complex. We've got to engage with the system. We've got to understand the system. We've got to understand how people are responding to it and how they're thinking about it so that we can influence it. We can't control it, but we can influence it. If I coach through this lens, I'm thinking really very differently. I am an agent in the functioning of this organization. The minute I start having conversations with people in the organization, whether that's in coaching or a client conversation or whatever. I am part of that organization, and the conversations I'm having are influential. They're influential in the room. What happens in the room may influence what happens outside the room. I'm going to be really interested in the organization and very conscious that I have an influence. I want to understand this organization and how meaning making happens in this organization. I'm going to look for opportunities to get more involved in this organization so that I can understand how it all works. Because the way I think is, yeah, I can have a conversation one-to-one with a coachee and they can say, yeah, I'm going to go and do this and I'm going to go and do that. But I know they then go back into the organization and they have other conversations which may change their perspective. When people come back not having done what they say they've done, I'm not cross at all. I'm curious. I'm interested as to what happened outside of the room. What conversations took place that ended up in my coachee coming up with different conclusions in the way that they're thinking and different actions. So I need to be self-aware of the influence I have here. I want supervision, but I want to work with a supervisor who understands this frame of reference and can help me think more through this lens. I want to get, as I said, more involved. If I think through this lens, I'm perhaps more likely to be enthusiastic about group coaching and team coaching in the organization and maybe getting involved in other ways. Coaching competencies, I think of coaching competencies very differently. They're not this rule book of supposedly evidence-based rules that I can stick in a frame on the wall and that'll do it. Coaching competencies emerge. I actually was involved in the last round of the ICF competency piece. Basically, what happened is all over the world, they got groups of coaches to sit around and talk about what the coaching competencies should be. And the ICF's latest sense of competencies emerged from those different conversations. And those kinds of conversations, by the way, are still taking place. And people's views on those competencies are still continuing to change. So I think quite differently through this lens as a coach. And how many counters would you say reflect how you show up as a coach? How often? Again, we're not saying this way of coaching is better than coaching through a linear, non-linear, or a collaborative systemic lens. We're not saying it's better, but we're saying there's a value in being adaptable and being able to access this way of thinking when it's appropriate. The barrier to this way of thinking amongst leaders is control. If I believe in control, then the complex systemic way of thinking is really quite threatening. Similarly, as a coach, if the way I work is to say to an organization, yep, I can help your coachee achieve X, Y, and Z, then I may find this way of thinking challenging. Now this slide's got the wrong heading, beg your pardon. This should say meta-systemic. This is the fifth way of thinking about systems and the last way, meta-systemic. Now the difference here is there's quite a lot of similarities between complex systemic and meta-systemic. The big difference is through the meta-systemic lens, I recognize that organizations are not systems. They are not systems. Organizations are not systems. My team is not a system. Systems, when I compare organizations and team to systems, I'm typically comparing it to something like a hot water system, or a really complicated aircraft engine, or the living body. All of those systems are composed of component parts, and those component parts are not human beings. Human beings make sense of the world for themselves. They're not compliant. They are not predictable. Organizations are not systems. The boundaries we construct between our team and other teams and organizations and outside the systems, they're made up. They're social constructions. My organization, in what sense is my organization a real entity? I do a lot of work I was doing until recently, quite a lot of work, for example, at KPMG. Their offices are just over the bay, and I see their big office building. In that office building are plenty of people who work for KPMG. There's lots of contractors in there too. There's lots of people who work for joint ventures. And so that change that emerges does not emerge only from people in the organization. If you're a team coach, or if you're a team leader, the conversations that if you want to understand the dynamics of the team, don't think just about the conversations that take place within the team. Those people in the team are having conversations with lots of other people too. The meta-systemic perspective is not an anti-systemic perspective, because it says all those ways of thinking that I've already described, they're useful. They're useful. Sometimes it's useful to simplify things, and comparing organizations to systems is a way of simplifying things. It makes it easy to understand and helps us work out what to do rather than just getting paralyzed in all this complexity. But they're still just metaphors. They're still just metaphors. And the thing to watch out for, even using the complex systemic metaphor, is that we overprivilege these boundaries. So again, think about COVID. This is Tedros Adhanom, not quite sure if I pronounced that, but he said, you know, during COVID, we've got a choice. Can we come together to face a common and dangerous enemy, or will we allow ourselves to become distracted and divided? And my own perspective on COVID is that many countries became distracted and divided. Many countries focused on their own efforts and put up walls to other countries. It happened to a degree actually with the States inside Australia, thinking that these boundaries are real. If we put our hard boundaries down, then we won't get infected. Of course, those boundaries aren't real. You can stop people at airports. You can say people can't get off your cruise ship, but the virus still got in. These boundaries are not real. The reality is we're all together on the same planet, and we need to think about things like COVID together. So if I'm thinking about COVID through this lens, I'm thinking people are unpredictable. Everything's connected. We need to engage with all our networks. We can all influence this together, but we can't control it. It's a different way of thinking. You think about the team piece again. Here's Sally, right? If Sally's thinking through the complex systemic lens, she's thinking about herself and her team and the conversations that are happening in herself and her team and what's emerging from those conversations. She might think more broadly about the function, the marketing function, more broadly about the organization, but she's thinking systems and subsystems. The reality is Sally is not only influenced by people in the team. Sally's actually more influenced by her best friend than she is by Bob, who's a team member. So let's not overprivilege these boundaries. It's a subtle difference, I think, but an important difference. So if I'm through this lens, the difference is I'm thinking organizations are not systems. Sorry, that should say not systems. Organizations are not systems. And to navigate change, we need to understand the meaning-making process happening right across the social network, not just within our little system or subsystem, however we choose to define it. We need to recognize that we are all influenced by everybody that we come into contact with, whether they're in our team, in our organization or not. Coaching competencies, by the way, have emerged not just between conversations between coaches, but coaches go off and have conversations with lots of other people about coaching. It's not just a conversation that takes place within coaching organizations. So my last invitation to you to allocate some counters. How many counters would you like to allocate to this way of thinking? So time for poll 2. Oh, sorry, the barrier here is this overprivileging of models, this overprivileging of simplifying models. They're useful, but we mustn't overprivilege them. So the question for you now, to which way of thinking systemically, these are all ways of thinking systemically, to which way of thinking systemically did you allocate most counters? Linear systemically, non-linear systemically, collaborative systemic, complex systemic, or meta-systemic? And the answer is always fascinated to see how people respond. How are we going? And do we have results? Interesting. Cool. Thank you. That's really interesting. Of course, I imagine some of you are kind of thinking, oh, you went through all that a bit fast. Obviously, I've kind of gone through this quite quickly in the time that we've had available. Here's some things that you can do if this is interesting. Number one, you can go to the website. We've got a website, Systems 5 Ways, and we've picked some movies that reflect each way of thinking. So if you want to kind of engage with this topic in a fun way, and the weather's not very good, spend a day watching some movies with some tips from the website. You can read the books, the Coaching Systemically 5 Ways of Thinking About Systems. Everything I've talked about is in there. You'll also hear, you can read something about the systemic approach in coaching in 3 dimensions and where some of those ideas originated in Tower of Dialogue and Leading Change. And details on how to get those books is on the website, www.leadingsystemically.com. More books. We've got, as we learned at the beginning of this, we have a new book coming out called The Wise Leader, which includes the systemic thinking piece in terms of helping leaders to think about how to wrestle with complexity differently. We have the Team Leader Instruction Manual coming out, which again talks about systems and politics. We do have free resources. So there's 2 websites here where you can find some white papers on the systemic piece. That's on the top website, and also some reflections on the wisdom work that we've been doing. Find a supervisor. Find a supervisor who, you should always have a conversation with the supervisor to see what the match is like. Find a supervisor who you think may help you in your journey and exploration of these different ways of thinking about systems. Finally, come back and see us in February, where we've got a longer webinar where there'll be less emphasis on the theory. We won't go into the theory any more than we have done today, really. We'll be talking about how to put these ideas and how to put this theory into practice, and also be talking about how they are relevant to team coaching. And that's it.
Thank you so much. That was a very insightful session and I think very necessary systemic coaching. And you finished it right on time. So thank you so much for that.
Well,
It's time for the Q&A from the audience. So audience, request you, if you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A box and in the chat. And while those questions are coming in, I'd also like to very briefly tell you about this webinar program that Dr. Paul Lawrence just mentioned. So let me share my screen. Right, so a special program is coming for our uExcelerate coaches, which will be uExcelerate's integrated coaching program, talking about the whole self and the whole system, a holistic coaching program. It'll be a CCE credit program with a total of 12 CCE credits for 4 modules to help you develop your expertise as a coach. So as you can see, we'll have 4 modules for 3 hours each with 3 CCE credit points allotted per module. So our first module will be around ethics and AI in digital coaching to help you understand the latest ethical guidelines around coaching, digital coaching, and AI. Our second module is what Dr. Paul Lawrence was talking about. He will be facilitating that session and will be around systemic coaching and how to with coaches in the organizational setting. Our third module will be around team coaching, which will be conducted by Ro Garel. And our fourth module will be around laser coaching with mind kinetics with Beth. This program is launching in February 2023 with very limited seats. So keep an eye out for more announcements and register at your earliest. Thank you for that. So let's move on to the questions now. We have a lot of questions coming in. So, oh, sorry, there's a poll. If please let us know if you'd like to know more about this systemic coaching program. Okay.
There is one question there. It says, how can we choose frogs that have a different systemic thinking model compared to ours to collaborate with? My answer to that would be that I've described these 5 different ways of thinking about systems. It's a thematic analysis. It's not the only way of thinking about the systems literature, but it's a framework. And that framework gives us a reference point. Essentially, I would go talk to some other frogs, whether that be coaches or clients. I'd talk to them and I'd ask them questions to seek to understand what they mean by systems thinking, what they mean by coaching systemically, and that'll give you a clue as to how they're thinking, and as I think is implied by the question, enable you to get a diversity of perspective.
Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. We have one. What would you suggest could be the first simple step to start using this approach in coaching?
What I'd say there is thinking. The way that we coach is very much based on the way that we think. So a lot of training, not just in the coaching space, tends to be this is what you need to do. Follow steps 1 to 5, do this, do that, do that. This really says, so what's the first simple step you can do? I'd say go onto the websites, download some of the free materials and get a little bit more confident and familiar with these different ways of thinking, and just decide for yourself which makes sense and which don't. Some of the ways of thinking may be a little different. You go, wow, I hadn't thought of things that way. And that will give you some ideas then around the kinds of questions you're going to ask and the kinds of things you're going to do in the coaching space. The other first simple step, and this is not an advert, but we will be doing the webinar in February, which, as I said, I'm not going to introduce any new theory into that webinar. It'll be around just that. What do I do based on these different ways of thinking?
We have we have a question here. I have a question regarding the difference between collaborative and complex. Both of them seem to be fluid and open. So is the difference in collaborative within internal canvas versus complex outside?
The difference is, if I'm thinking through that collaborative systemic lens, I still am thinking about the organization as a system, like an airplane engine. It's a system, it's mechanical, and it's just terribly difficult to understand. So if I look at this aircraft engine, I might go, yeah, I think I know how it works. So I'm going to go and do what I'm going to do. The collaborative systemic piece says, yeah, hang on, don't assume you know how it works. Get 3 or 4 people together to have a good look at it and think about how it works, and then get them to compare notes. And whatever they come up with as a solution, we can go, and that's the solution that we're going to go and do to the system. That's the collaborative systemic perspective. The complex systemic perspective is quite different. Very different way of thinking. It says, okay, so you're going to get a group of people together to think about how the engine works. That conversation is just one conversation that's happening in the organization. Whatever you come up with is not going to be a prescriptive solution. It's just what you've decided as a group. There's another group of people over there who've also been having a look at the aircraft engine. They've come up with a different perspective, and that's how change works. And if I want to, so I can't control what to do, but I can influence by seeking to understand how everybody's making sense of this thing, and that'll enable me to then think, right, what's the most useful thing I can say next? Not in the hope that I'm going to be able to control the outcome, but in the hope that I can influence the outcome. So the collaborative and the complex perspectives are really quite different.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have any more?
The movie list, I could share the movie list, but there's a website called, which is www.systems5ways.com, www.systems5ways.com, and that lists the movies and talks about them in the context of the theory. But the movies are The Butterfly Effect, Groundhog Day, Chaos Theory, what's the fourth one? Mr. Nobody. And then the fifth one isn't really a movie, it's a TV show called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency.
Thank you for sharing.
In that email there isn't, that email address there isn't right. It's not Systems 5 Ways FIVE, it's systems number 5 ways.com. I'll type it in here again.
Okay, so we are also live streaming on LinkedIn, so we have some questions coming from there. We have a comment. The session was very interesting. I have a fundamental question about the leader as a coach. Can a leader truly be a coach or any of his or her team members, given the fact that their career somewhere depends on the impression and the biases she may develop after knowing about the shortcomings or certain underlying issues?
I definitely think leaders can coach. The issue here is around purpose. So that's one of the issues. What's my purpose in this conversation? There are lots of conversations that, as a leader, somebody who reports to me comes up with an issue. I have a choice about, do I help them work that issue through themselves, or do I tell them the answer? And helping them work it through for themselves may be a more useful approach than giving them the answer. If, however, the person wants to be coached on career and doesn't want to share with me that they're thinking about leaving, then I may not be the best coach for them. So there's a piece around purpose, and there's who's the right coach. And by the way, you can apply the same thing to external coaches. If what I want from my external coach is more of a kind of mentor type approach, lots of guidance and lots of advice, and I'm being matched with a coach who just doesn't do that and refuses to do it, then maybe I want a different coach. So there's a piece around matching. And by the way, the role of a leader coach, the leader coach isn't just coaching people who are reporting to them. The leader coach can coach sideways, the leader coach can coach upwards. So it's more than just about that kind of career development piece, in my view.
Thank you so much. And I think we've reached the end of our session as well. So thank you once again, Dr. Paul Lawrence, for very concisely going through the whole systemic coaching and giving everyone a clear understanding. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. We found this insightful. Please stay tuned for more announcements on the program coming in February and other webinars coming soon. Thank you so much.
Great.
Have a good day.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.